Hello, everyone, and thanks for tuning in, and welcome to MTM's pod. So I'm Marina Graham. I'm MTM's Director of Cultural Insights and Trends, and today I'm joined by Alex Gibson, who's Associate Director of our Cultural Insights and Trends team, and our beloved futurist, collaborator, and Gen Z expert, Holly Friend. Today, we're going to be delving into a topic that for the last few months has been our Roman Empire, Gen Z, gender divide. Gender is something that we spend a bit of time, actually a lot of time, thinking about at MTM. We have been sort of reporting on and monitoring the developments that we have seen and the pendulum swings from sort of hyper, gender inclusivity towards now what we're seeing is a lot more sort of a revert back to more traditional gender norms and roles. Whether it's a cultural milestone of Barbieheimer, the TikTok trends of girl dinner and trad wives, or the ongoing influence of Andrew Tate, the last year has been full of examples that show us gender norms are thriving, even among a generation who are known for breaking down binaries. So to unpack this, Holly, Alex, and I have been just working away at trying to find out the truth here and what is actually going on. So to do that, we have been reading and listening and sort of immersing ourselves into everything that's going on in the news. But we also have spoken to experts and real Gen Zers who sort of represent different aspects of masculinity and femininity and sort of different diverse experiences and perspectives to be able to get a sort of comprehensive view on what the reality is for this gender divide amongst Gen Z. So with all of that, let's get into it. I think this is a topic that we're all really excited about and obviously all think about a lot. So let's start with sort of going around and seeing what inspired us or what sort of interests us to do this research and explore further into the topic. So Holly, why don't we start with you? What are you excited about or what inspired you to get involved in this?
For sure. So I spent a lot of time researching Gen Z and their behaviors, their values, the way they're interacting with each other, how they see the world. And one thing that clients are always asking about and my mind is always on is the state of Gen Z activism, or at the moment, perhaps the lack of it. So previously in years, it would always be like, okay, Gen Z are reestablishing the world. They're reforming industries. They're restructuring norms, and especially gender norms was a big part of that. This was the generation that were really pushing gender fluidity and they, them pronouns. And it seemed like they were really breaking boundaries when it came
to beauty inclusivity, and so everything was just
exactly. Everything was different. It was all about the everyday as well. It was a lot more kind of rough and ready, which was super exciting. And then in the last year, and especially actually in the last few months, there've been some really interesting studies that have come out that have shown that this kind of progressiveness among this generation may not be as simple as it seems. And in fact, there was one study which I've not stopped thinking about since it came out. You could say it's my Roman Empire. To already mention a Gen Z gender TikTok trend is the idea that Gen Z boys are actually more likely than baby boomers to believe that feminism has done more harm than good.
Which is just wild, isn't it?
It's wild.
We always talk about boomers being so sort of like backwards, not understanding, and then to hear something like that is wild.
Yeah, it's the idea that like, oh, this is a generation that are going to save the world. They're going to save the planet. They're going to save climate change. They're going to save, our confused visions of identity.
And like the institutions and work. Like I remember post-COVID, it was really like a new dawn. And that Gen Z was going to completely sort of, I think there's a saying that millennials sort of like remade the table and Gen Z was going to totally flip it over and recreate it. And yeah.
Okay. Which they are doing, but by doing the opposite of what we thought they'd be doing.
Interesting, true.
So yeah, that just set my mind ablaze and I was like, okay, I'm interested. What's going on? Why is it going on? Is it true? Is it not true? And obviously, as we'll unpack in this conversation, there are so many nuances involved in that.
Yeah, because I think that's something that, you see these really sort of headline stats or data points about Gen Z, which often feel so contradictory to sort of our narrative about Gen Z as being this like progressive, inclusive, really like open-minded generation. So it's so interesting to be able to like unpick it and sort of explore it further. So Alex, what about you? What inspired you to do this research?
Yeah, well, I think you're right in the sense that, as cultural strategists, we want to really unpack any striking statistics like that and kind of understand the cultural picture around it and, build the cultural narrative. And I think you can't move too far from this conversation, at least from a kind of Gen Z male perspective, without hearing that buzzword of Andrew Tate. And, plenty of content has been made about him in the last year. But I think I was quite struck by how, many documentaries about him or kind of just conversations that I had around him and the general kind of manosphere, as it's been termed, kind of lack the nuance to understand kind of wider shifts that are influencing masculinity. And I think what's been really striking from speaking to both experts as part of this conversation and certain Gen Zs as well as part of the research is how a lot of these narratives start from quite innocuous places. So, we will touch on the kind of crisis of masculinity. And as part of that, we've looked at that kind of void for male self-development. A lot of the content that we would label quite toxic, which I think is a term in itself that we're going to try and move away from, and it might be part of the problem in itself. Kind of behind that is more of this kind of self-development type content for men. So how to motivate yourself in your career and in work, and how to motivate yourself in fitness or in finance. And so
meet women as well.
Exactly. And how to make yourself a kind of more desirable partner. And a lot of these kind of drivers for men start from quite, innocent, well-meaning places. And so there's a much bigger kind of story to tell here that I think we wanted to kind of unpack. And then obviously, with such a gloomy picture as we kind of just described, look at what the future holds and where the optimism lies in the next few years.
Always looking for that silver lining. But it's true in terms of with that term crisis of masculinity. I mean, we've been looking at trends for years now about sort of like friendship recession, how, the loneliness epidemic, we've gone from toxic masculinity or machoism to more inclusive, but versions of masculinity. But I mean, there's a huge part of the population that I feel like feels unseen or unheard or sort of just confused of where they stand, it's so interesting to sort of go further into that.
Marina, what about you? What inspired you to delve into this research?
So I feel like mine's a little bit more of a personal motivation or interest. I think I just had a baby, was on mat leave and came back and sort of was watching and loving how 2023 was like the year of girlhood. And I guess it's pretty cringy to even say this, but as like a very proud girl in a lot of ways, I loved that there was this.
We'll get onto that later.
Yeah, we'll get onto that later. But I loved how there is all of this sort of reclamation and empowerment and sort of owning being a girly girl and sort of making that something really positive and a community around it. Now, I know there's a lot of debate and sort of different opinions on it, but ultimately I like the interpretation of it as being this really sort of empowering and an opportunity for women to own their sort of feminine side and to redefine it and to make it their own. In terms of one aspect, obviously, of that has been the rise of the trad wives, which... I mean, again, as a new mom, I feel just personally attacked by these gorgeous and put together women like Nara Smith, who just makes bubblegum from scratch.
I know, I saw that the other day.
The green, I wanted to try the green bubblegum, and the apple bubblegum looked amazing.
I mean, she's influenced you, so
she does, and she's all over. Like, my algorithm is all over this. And I think what's interesting is that first when we were talking about this, I'd leave the sessions be like, oh God, I feel like all my decisions were wrong. Like, what I was sold the lie of that you can do it all. And maybe that's not the case. But actually, as we sort of delve deeper into it and as we sort of looked at it, I actually think it's more about the aesthetic of the trad wives. It's not necessarily about buying into their values or their religion or their sort of way of life, but it's an opportunity to sort of admire it and sort of have that time to really enjoy their aesthetically pleasing feeds where, everything's a little bit slower and everything's a bit blissful domesticity. And I think what's interesting too is how brands are going to do that. So we're seeing a lot of brands sort of tapping into this aesthetic. Aritzia and Calvin Klein have done deals with Nara Smith. And again, the thing is they're not buying in or aligning with their values. They're aligning with that aesthetic. So I think all of these aesthetics around femininity and sort of where it's going is a really exciting and cool.
even the girlhood aesthetics, everything had bows on it. It's interesting because even a few years ago, we were all talking about cottagecore.
Yeah.
And I'm sure everyone listening to this already knows about cottagecore. If they don't know about trad wives, they definitely know about cottagecore. And it feels like cottagecore, we thought it was going to be a fad. And we thought it was a kind of COVID reaction. It was like, oh, we're going to like go to the countryside. We're going to like bake bread. We'll feel safe because we're in these bubbles. We're in nature. We're not in these big crowded cities. And actually the cottagecore has stuck around. It's evolved into the trad wife.
So, and I think it's this desire for like to slow down and just, we're all burnt out. I think people are really tired. I don't want to sound pessimistic, but I think there has been, especially on women, like a lot of pressure and a lot to juggle. And
that's a great segue into the drivers.
I love it when that is fun.
I wanted to ask you, what do you think has been driving this from the female perspective?
I think from the female perspective, like when I was coming into my career, it was all about like the girl boss and hustling and this sort of dream to, have it all and act like, to be successful, you sort of have to act like a man and be empowered and sort of be successful at all costs. And ultimately, I think that frame of mind and that sort of concept or template of living, it doesn't work, right? There's clear things where women are more burnt out. And as a result of that, I think we're seeing this like return to things being like slower. There is this rejection of that millennial girl boss ethos and mindset. And now we're seeing Gen Z and younger people being like, okay, so that clearly didn't work because they're all miserable and exhausted. So we want to do it differently. I think that's bringing up all these different ways of sort of living your life and choice feminism. And there's a lot of interesting phenomenons around like women in retrograde, which is talking about how we're seeing younger generations actually like recluse to quite traditional ways of living and gender stereotypes.
It's quite normal as well, isn't it? When we're like scared or we feel this sense of kind of uncertainty in the world, that's when we retreat to norms. And that's when we kind of protect ourselves with things like family.
Totally.
Intimacy and belonging and these things that we've kind of been missing.
When we spoke to some Gen Zers for this, it was interesting how they sort of looked at, and this was women, by the way, but how they looked at marriage as being like their happy ending, about when everything would sort of come together and you'd be stable. And it's just interesting. I was actually just reading an article and this relationship psychologist was like, it's kind of a dangerous mindset because actually relationships in a lot of ways are the least predictable. Like you don't know of how your partner is going to evolve or if they're going to fall out of love with you or if some hardship is going to come and break you apart. So there's this notion that, relationships and settling down in marriage equals like stability and security, which is incredibly desirable and sort of something that we all want when we feel so uncertain and so scared and so out of control.
Yeah, it's almost like this kind of positive, optimistic sense of delusion.
Just truly romantic, isn't it?
Yeah.
That like...
Yeah, there's a real kind of string of romance running through this generation, I think, as well. And I know we want to chat a bit about dating later as well. And I
love dating trends. So fun.
And I think the romance is key there too. But yeah, same with the Gen Zs I spoke to in terms of how they were seeing trad wives. And I was like, so, do you or your friends want to settle down, have babies, get married, want to live the life of Ballerina Farm, who is...
How did she do it all? She literally has like 9 children. She has like just had 4 baby girls in a row, and she's like making mozzarella from scratch with a baby attached to her and like 6 kids.
It's very Sound of Music. It's very like kids like being part.
She's literally like feeding birds and singing to them.
Exactly.
But it's that sort of depiction that makes me feel, I'm like, I have 1 child and I'm struggling. How is she doing it with like 9 children?
But that's the thing, is that the Gen Zs were kind of saying like, well, they know it's a fantasy.
Yes.
They know the only reason we're still interacting with this content is because it's beautiful, is because it's aesthetic and it's gorgeous, and they live in these like incredible houses, because there is a conversation about privilege and class as part of this. And it's like, why are they all rich? And it's like, well, you
can't really live that life if you're not.
And also the Instagram algorithm, people think they want to watch the everyday mundanity of someone's life, the day in the life content, but they want to watch day in the life content from a, stay-at-home girlfriend with like a gorgeous Scandi-style apartment in LA. And that's just always going to be the case, that we're going to be drawn to the aesthetic as long as culture is visual.
Yeah.
She said that mostly it's a fantasy. So they don't necessarily want these things. They don't necessarily want that stability. This was a London-based Gen Z, so maybe a slightly different way of thinking to a Gen Z who maybe is in more rural areas or in a different part of the world. But these girls were like, yeah, you know what? We like it because it's like looking into a neighbor's window.
So interesting. Yeah.
It's fascinating because it kind of scares us at the same time.
Well, it's just so different from, before COVID, we were writing trends about like, single society and about how like being single was the preferred choice and the empowered choice. And all of the stats that were like single women are happier and live longer and are healthier. And it's funny how that was sort of seen as aspirational in a way. And now it's sort of switched to, even if it's not a reality, it's like seen as an aspirational thing that you sort of want to peek into.
Yeah. And I think a lot of those kind of aspirations are mirrored on the male side of things. I think particularly some of the things you guys have talked about in terms of the fantasies of luxury. Like the male Gen Zs you've spoken to have spoken about how sort of money driven they are. And like, I think if you look at some of this, the more provocative content online, a lot of it sort of depicts supercars and that sort of thing. And I think that feels quite maybe, out of step with a couple of years ago still, where, there kind of maybe was a bit more of a yearning for
experiences.
Like experiences. And now kind of almost, craving materialism is acceptable again. And like Gen Zs are saying, like this might not be attainable for me, but there's no reason why I shouldn't admire it. We're seeing a lot more of those types of aspirations, and that's that is kind of outside of the London bubble as well. Like we spoke to Gen Zs in Northern Ireland and in more kind of rural areas as well, and that was something that I feel like is part of that whole that masculinity and that manosphere narrative at the same time.
Well, again, it's certainty, right? And security, like having, and obviously like status. But it is interesting how we're moving towards aspirational, being in some ways pretty not superficial, but it's we've gone back from, it was all about authenticity. Like at one point, if I heard the word authentic one more time, I was like, it just almost became such a buzzword. But it does seem to be now a little bit like, actually, we want things to be a bit hidden behind the curtains. We don't want to see every single nitty gritty thing. We want to have this sort of more polished visual of it.
Yeah, very much. Yeah, we're living in the age of the kind of artificial beauty being the norm. And but I do think that is changing.
It is changing.
Even looking at the Kardashians,
Kylie Jenner and her soft girl era.
Exactly. The emblem of femininity and culture, they are undoing their plastic surgery. They are looking for ways to become more kind of earthly and soft again, as opposed to these kind of like hard, chiseled, clean girl look that has very much been the rage the last few years.
And how do you think in terms of masculinity that sort of like manifests?
Yeah, I was going to say, I sort of feel like this is where the genders do really diverge. I was listening to a really interesting podcast by a guy, I think called William Costello yesterday, and he's a sort of PhD student at the University of Austin in Texas, and he was sort of talking about how rates of body dysmorphia in men are going to exceed rates in women in the next 10 years.
Ozempic.
Yeah. You mentioned like looks maxing, like
should we tell people what looks maxing is?
Yeah,
that's
so looks maxing is essentially if you kind of take the etymology of the word, like the maxing is the idea that you're kind of maxing out your potential aesthetic with
maximalism.
Yeah, maximalism of your body and your facial features, and a lot of that kind of manifests as sort of chiseling your jaws and kind of like practicing jaw exercises to get that kind of Chad jaw that supposedly women crave.
It's interesting that it comes directly after the era of the kind of the Timothy Chalamet.
I mean, I still Timothy Chalamet. Yeah, but
the girly boys or the K-pop stars and like men who were quite kind of feminine and quite non-threatening in their appearance, and it seems to be kind of a rejection of that, perhaps, as well.
Yeah, it's quite optimistic in a sense that like men through these very sort of unnatural means are still aspiring to do the best with their looks and things like that. But I think at the same time, I mean, you guys mentioned like the sense that, Gen Z women may feel a bit out of control with their lives, or, so many external factors that mean that they lack the control that previous generations had. And that lack of control, I think, is also driving this broader theme around primal masculinity that we've been seeing a lot of. So, there's more like sort of conventionally masculine looks through looks maxing as part of that, but also, we're seeing, really interesting rates of engagement with some of those more like combat sports, like rates of interest in
so the carnivore diets.
Yeah.
Who's the meat guy on TikTok who like literally eats raw?
So there's the meat influence.
I feel like I went through, I definitely had an afternoon where I was like, really?
Yeah, and it's such a move away from a few years ago where kind of, veganism was on the rise. And I mean,
we're trying to dairy as well.
Yeah, and one of the most interesting figures in this movement is Eddie Abu. I don't know if you guys follow him, but like he has absolutely kind of, shot to online stardom in the last few months. Even like he's got sort of 3 to 4 million followers on Instagram, and probably the same on TikTok. And he's a former bodybuilder who's kind of moved away from like the bodybuilding scene, but very much kind of now promotes this he's just a carnivore influencer essentially. And so and it's just
period.
His meals are meat and they're occasionally eggs, but like seasoning, they're nothing. But people love him because like he has these
he has
these no nonsense catchphrases, and he doesn't take any bullshit in terms of like processed foods, and very anti kind of the vegan diet. But I think, we are seeing kind of people, realize that in a way kind of natural diets were the carnivore diets in some sense.
I mean, I think there's a few things to unpack there too, in terms of like there was this sort of gap and need for like male role models in a way. And I think we're seeing sort of different forms of those manifest, from like, yes, the bodybuilders to the sort of like all carnivore to even like, dare I say it, Andrew Tate. But like, I think hopefully now we're moving towards a more positive sort of development of male role models. But I was going to say, in terms of that natural beauty point, we've been talking a lot about the fertility crisis, which I will get into in a little bit. But when you said that sort of natural point about like primal masculinity, and when we were talking about that sort of soft girl beauty and going back to that form of like sort of earthy femininity, ultimately it feels in a way it's about going back to nature, where you're sort of like the most primed and attractive for like reproductive, like in a sense. I remember like hearing that like long hair was a sign of like fertility, like healthy long hair. So like you can see that in fashion, seeing healthy like glowy lips and blushed cheeks. It's all signs of like health and fertility. And then with men, it's that, go back to the basics of like hunter-gatherer, that strength, that sort of like even carnivore slant on things. It feels
protect the kids.
Yes, it feels so primal in both cases, which is funny because it sort of happened alongside each other.
So there was another really interesting study last year that showed that, given that we're talking a lot about Gen Z here, like their levels of engagement with MMA was far higher than kind of the general population. Same with boxing, is the second highest sport in terms of engagement versus like 7th or 8th in terms of the general population. And like weightlifting as well is kind of in the top 20 sports for
niche.
Yeah, exactly. Kind of presumably people tuning into some very remote like TV channels to watch a bit of weightlifting on Saturday afternoon.
Maybe we'll come back to this later, but to me it feels like the sense of embodiment really feels in response to the kind of disembodiment we've all felt from the last few years of being so online. And obviously like for many of us, since we were like 12, 13, being online and kind of, turning our personalities and our souls into social media entities. But then of course the last few years in the pandemic, working online, living in Zoom meetings, everything like that, we've become so disembodied and we've not really understood like how to, or the way we've been moving our bodies has been like for efficiency. We've been like going to quick HIIT classes or yoga classes that are meant to help us feel less anxious, whatever it is, but we're not really we're not really sinking into our bodies in the way that we could be. And I think that desire to get involved in boxing or fighting, or I know even
it's also fashion, right? It's community and belonging.
Yeah, things like fishing, like hobbies that are to do with the outdoors. In London, Flock Together, bird watching, like all these groups that are walking together, running together. It does feel like we're really trying to get more into our bodies and be less intellectual, less analytical about all of the micro details of our lives.
I think that was like a huge theme of our 2024 trends report, which is, there definitely does seem to be this tech backlash. Like we're just seeing it across so many different things where people are looking to like find, there's such self-imposed loneliness in a way where you realize you've spent all day by yourself. One thing I'm interested to get your views on, to talk about it a little bit, is a big thing that we've been finding is we've heard a lot about like the manosphere and the womanosphere and this mindset of, focus on yourself and screw women, screw men, depending on your gender. And also this is a very hetero sort of sexual take on stuff. But what are your thoughts on sort of that division and where that's going?
I've been so interested in this because I feel like it's such a big part of the millennial identity.
I can confirm Holly and I have had many sort of clashes on this. Not aggressive ones, but just said, really?
Yeah, it's been interesting. It's been enlightening. But yeah, the I should say the millennial hetero female identity, and there's a term heteropessimism, which is fascinating to me. And there's a really interesting article by Asa Sarasin called On Heteropessimism, which looks at this in more detail. But it's basically about how we've got to this point in culture where women are embarrassed to be heterosexual in this kind of memified way. Usually that's not very useful to developing better relationships. Rather, like instead of actually trying to make relationships better, people are just kind of completely renouncing it and saying, men are trash, dump him. I think this peaked maybe about like 5 to 8 years ago.
We were talking about with like Slumflower,
Florence Given is a great example of this too, like the dump him t-shirts. And it was very, very in line with girl boss because it was like, you can do everything and
very focused on the individual. It's all about sort of focusing on you and screw everything else.
Yeah, you are incredible and he doesn't deserve you. It was very powerful at the time and it really empowered a lot of women, and I'm sure it empowered so many women to leave bad relationships and things like that.
And to find sort of companionships with like friendships and platonic love. And that was
the Dolly Alderton generation.
Well, yes, Dolly, I love her. But like essentially I'm all for like female friendship.
Yeah, but it was interesting because I had a conversation with Emma Baker, who's one of our experts, and she was saying that actually that maybe this kind of extension of adolescence that a lot of these women represented, which was, being single well into your 30s, even 40s plus, which is obviously a great movement. But in terms of women feeling like they might maybe have cut themselves off from human relationships, or again, tried to do everything, tried to do their career, tried to have this like increasingly large network of friends that they need to catch up with, but also looked after themselves, and actually maybe recognizing that the simple way of living is to kind of strip that back a bit and to go back to maybe only having a couple of friends and having one partner, or having one career instead of being a polymath or whatever it is, and actually
just do less, essentially.
Doing less.
Yeah,
true. And I think that the Gen Zs are very embarrassed by the millennial girl boss attitudes.
So embarrassed that they're so embarrassed. But
a lot of this is coming from that embarrassment.
Yeah. I think what's so interesting about heteropessimism, though, is that it sort of manifests differently for men and women. So I was reading actually that for men, it's a lot about, especially on the back of like the Me Too era, and there's this feeling of them being like under attack or sort of like dismissed and misunderstood, and that actually it's easier to just sort of remove women from their lives because they can sort of get on with it. So sorry to keep going to you for tell us the men's.
Yeah, well, no, and also I think we had talked about this beforehand, right? And I was like, oh, is it okay, kind of, expressing some of these opinions on behalf of Gen Z? But I think that kind of like that men are trash movement has had a bit of a backlash from Gen Z men, which I think is worth kind of flagging as well. You know, one of the Gen Z that we spoke to, he was conscious of that gender divide and maybe a perception that that men were kind of under attack, as you say, or kind of repressed and not able to be proud to be men because in his words there was kind of a saying going around at school a couple of years ago of kill all men, and like for him that didn't seem to represent anything that was remotely, well, certainly not kind of empowering.
Oh, don't want to be murdered.
Yeah.
It's not equality.
Yeah. It's worth reflecting on how some of those kind of catchphrase eras of girl boss feminism have kind of had a bit of a negative implication on Gen Z men. So if we do try and unpack why the gender divide is there, if it is there, then
are we saying it's the women's fault? Actually, interesting. Do we think that the womanosphere or the manosphere sort of started first? Because we've seen also online, what's the group that do it your own way, incel community?
Men going their own way.
Yeah, men going their own way. And all of these communities, which is all, again, the opposite about like focus on yourself and like ditch women. And so I'm not sure if that was a response like chicken or egg.
The men are trash movement, I think, is one tiny puzzle piece in the jigsaw of what's kind of driven the manosphere. And I think, I always think these things are quite interesting to sort of take the cultural influences as far back as you can, really. And I think you mentioned like the fertility crisis, and there's been a whole, shift in the data over the last like 30 to 40 years of, reduced sperm count.
Fertility was a trend we wrote about a few years ago, actually, because it's been so not in the spotlight.
Yeah.
Going to come back in a big way.
Yeah. And that kind of, the more those types of studies are kind of circulated, the more that kind of infiltrates those types of communities. And so, without male fertility and also with kind of, the realignment of the economy, which has seen, obviously over the course of decades, like far more women paving their own way and far more kind of female presence in the workplace, there is this perception that kind of men have lost their kind of like hunter-gatherer role, if you want to kind of go back to the hunter-gatherers again. And so there is that loss of a sense of control, perhaps, I think.
And there is, I feel like there's just also been a huge identity shift and a positioning shift where, it's been a society structure that like benefited and loved men for so long. And then now all of a sudden it was like, no, you're actually the problem. You're the enemy, and not a sort of productive way. It was quite it's your fault, not mine. In terms of dating, should we talk about dating a little bit?
Let's talk about dating.
I think what's interesting there is just how we're seeing like people seek out, meaningful relationships. And so many of the dating apps have totally pivoted to sort of be in line with that sentiment. We're also seeing a bunch of new ones that are coming out, which are all about, in IRL connections and meeting people who actually want long-term relationships, being very sort of upfront about what you want. But one thing that one of the Gen Zers that I was interviewing said, and this is a tale as old as time, but like Gen Z men aren't as keen to commit just yet than their female counterparts, which again, I feel like happens in every single generation. I'm old enough now that I can be like, in my day, that also happened.
So maybe the millennials.
So maybe, do you have any sort of hot takes or thoughts in terms of dating or relationships from...
I've always got a hot take on trips, yeah. No, I mean, kind of, anecdotally to that point about Gen Z men being less fond of commitment. Certainly kind of the Gen Z men that we spoke to for this study said that life was too busy, too overwhelming to consider relationships. And I think it probably is a millennial thing, or, certainly kind of going further back, like that you wouldn't have to compromise one or the other. But I think there was very much just kind of a sense from these Gen Z men that just getting through school, college, and into
Gen Z men and their girl boss years.
I think we might have,
we buy squat. You always hear that like boys develop later than girls. I mean, maybe.
Yeah, boy boss. Here we go.
Also, to bring up Ballerina Farm again, interesting example of like a family that has a lot of media coverage where the dad and the young dad is a big part of the family unit and is doing the work and isn't absent or, just making the money or at work.
True.
Anything like that. It's not even...
Same with Lucky Blue with Nora Smith.
Exactly.
You're like, well, I mean, the other day there was a video of him buying her a Bottega bag and surprising her. I was like, lovely, so nice. And, you know,
Well done, her.
yeah, well done, great, now. You're like 23.
Gen Z men in terms of dating as well. I think the same level of exhaustion that women find is there among men as well. But I think we are already starting to see that these kind of more in-person connections are coming right back as an alternative. I mean, you mentioned kind of there are alternative apps for more in-person connections, but just kind of doing away with the apps altogether and focusing on, you know, with the rise of pottery classes.
Wasn't Strava now a dating app too?
Well, I think you could probably term it as a dating app in terms of like, you know, the run clubs that people find on there and like the interactions that leads to and how, you know, that becomes such a big part of people's social circles. So we spoke to Jay from Imagine Insights as one of our experts for this, and he was talking kind of anecdotally among his friends that run clubs were the kind of the new way to find romance. And
it's kind of like an intentional meet cute. It's sort of like in a way sort of like
engineering.
Yes, engineering. Yes, exactly. So let's talk about the future. So where do we think things are going? I know we always like to make sure that there is a positive narrative for the future because there's enough doom and gloom in the present. So, Alex, what do you think is going to be the future of sort of gender roles?
Yeah, well, I like the sentiment because I think we covered the word crisis quite a lot.
Yeah,
in
the poly crisis. That's very much kind of
and maybe like one of those, you know, crises I think has now a bit of a backlash. So we talked about men kind of feeling a sense that they've lost their place in the world, or you know, their place in industry and that sort of thing. But I think what's really exciting is we're seeing what we've called a blue collar revival. And I think that's, you know, we're seeing that online. So I think what's really exciting is we're seeing lots of TikTok influencers that are talking about their lives on from like wood chopping and on oil rigs. I mean, we were talking earlier about this kind of whole TikTok trend about talking about, or, you know,
telling these like young female influencers telling their dads that they got a 2-month gig on an oil rig.
Yeah,
amazing.
But I think there's kind of like this sense that the blue collar revival is men and women, but like, you know, reclaiming their place in industry and in the economy. I think what's interesting about this blue collar masculinity and this blue collar revival is it is a whole lot more wholesome and a whole lot more sensitive than maybe how it's been depicted in the past. There's actually a really interesting TikTok account run by a trans guy called Leo, and he tells a lot of anecdotes of life on the steel mill site that he works on. But what's really interesting and kind of quite unique about his perspective is he's much more able to kind of analyze these signifiers of masculinity and some of these behaviors that a lot of other kind of conventionally very hyper-masculine steel mill workers maybe haven't addressed themselves in the past. And so it's a really interesting kind of narrative to see there.
Do you think there's going to be more of a softness to these, you know, quite, you know, masculine skewing or sort of traditionally masculine industries or cultures, or
more women entering them as well, like in the way that women, you know, there's a big like women in STEM movement the last like 5-10 years. But do you think that's going to kind of go into these more manual skilled labor jobs?
Yeah, I think if we're looking at what's next, I think we're looking at a whole rebalancing. So, you know, if our trends kind of for the now are masculine and feminine, I think we are going to see kind of a convergence. And as you say, it kind of is the flip side of the economy to the women in STEM movement is this kind of more aspirational but also more welcoming and inclusive blue collar movement as well. And I think those types of online narratives and the oil refinery trend and things like that are part of that shift towards
making it more accessible.
Yeah. So, you know, it's kind of if now is the kind of hyper masculinity, I think you know, we're also going to see a lot more women kind of going into those traditionally hyper masculine roles as well.
I think that sort of point around women going into more, you know, hyper masculine areas is a big thing that I feel like for the future is building empathy and connection between the genders. So sort of ending this gender bashing which is going on and actually trying to find common ground. And I think actually one thing that we've been seeing and will continue to see is women entering sort of more traditionally male skewing sports. What was that? You told me that there's something about, was it wrestling?
Yeah, like women's wrestling is kind of having, women's boxing as well as having a a real moment, especially in Hollywood. So Sydney Sweeney is about to play a female boxer.
What can't she do?
She has, I think this is kind of the final string to her bow. I suppose. It's kind of the female Rocky. Coming by opposite.
She'll rule the world after.
And we even seen in the last kind of couple of months, Love Lies Bleeding, which I think has, if we've been talking about primal masculinity and hypermasculinity earlier in the conversation, really interesting for portraying hypermasculinity, but through a feminine lens. So if you guys haven't seen it, it portrays this very kind of muscular.
That's Kirsten Stewart, right? Yeah. It's her girlfriend. That's the wrestler.
Yes, yeah. And she's this sort of extremely muscular woman who's a bodybuilder in New Mexico, I think it is. And she's working out in the very hypermasculine gym that Kirsten Stewart's character works in. And what's really interesting about that portrayal is she's not depicted kind of in situ with a lot of the hypermasculine men. She's kind of depicted, out there on her own, like forging her own path. And it doesn't have to be a kind of a contrast between
me against you type thing.
The male bodybuilders and the kind of out of place women.
Well, because I think in a way it's about finding that common ground, and there's a mutual respect. A lot of work goes into that training, into learning something new. I think also in that point of building empathy and connection, we're seeing a lot of I don't know where to exactly place this, but in terms of the sort of like TikTok accounts about the comedian, boys' bedrooms, where she essentially goes into these people get nominated who have disastrous rooms and are super messy, and she goes in and sort of helps organize them. Or who is the fashion stylist who started that reality?
Oh, Michelle Lee.
Yeah, and she's got a new reality series which is all about helping tech bros find themselves by learning how to dress. And there's something quite, I think, nice about,
and non-patronizing.
Yes, it's non-patronizing. I think there's sort of a two-way benefit where men start to realize and fully appreciate the pressure that is on women to, look good, make their home perfect, make everything about their sort of appearance and their presentation sort of on point. But also it's about women sort of helping men feel better. So it feels like a very sort of mutual beneficial relationship where, they're learning more about each other, but also learning to appreciate each other and sort of help one another. We're all going to be friends, guys, in the future.
Yeah, the Gen Z I spoke to as well also said that this type of, I think she called it instructional content, has been very much geared towards women in recent years. So everything from the skin regimes to, how to organize your cupboard or whatever it might be, all these hacks and productivity talk that we saw, all very much geared towards women. And brands have very much jumped on that too. And, I think even in I think it was in the Boys' Bedroom article, they were talking about, why is it that all of these homeware or cleaning or maybe even the food and the supper clubs content
influence
is all marketed for women. And by kind of looking to all, changing the algorithms, and
true.
That's part of it, as well as that instructional content for men that maybe will help stop them turning to places where they might go down a rabbit hole, and they go into the manosphere with good intentions, and suddenly days have passed, and they're a man going their own way.
Yeah. Well, I think also in terms of learning anything new is quite intimidating, right? So if you don't feel like you've got content or support or things to learn, it's very easy to sort of eschew it or sort of dismiss your responsibility of it. I do that all the time. If I don't understand something, I'm no, not my problem. But I think, yes, by sharing that load and creating content and sort of educating the different genders of their more traditional pastimes, whether it's extreme sports, God, I can't believe this, or cleaning and domesticity. Not that that's just a female pastime, but it often falls on women.
Yeah, but I think building off that as well, coming back to dating as well, and the future of dating. I think Holly, you coined a trend of kind of mid masculinity, and you identified the guy Tony P on Instagram, and he's kind of the archetypal vision of that. So it's essentially this guy, this well-earning 26-year-old that lives in DC, and he documents a lot of his kind of dating life, but not from a kind of bro perspective, but from a kind of really thoughtful place, and him preparing his outfit for his date, and like him planning, booking the restaurant, and like really a kind of like an old school romance type angle on dating, and also like the aspirational side of earning like a fairly good salary in a big city and that sort of thing. I think like that's, there will be, a lot of female followers who like the kind of sensitive sides to the content, but also it is a bit of a toolkit and a guidebook for men who feel like they've been put off the dating market as well.
Something we haven't talked about as well is the idea of sentimentality and like feeling your feelings, which I think has been very kind of pushed out of possibility by the girl boss era. And what we've seen with Gen Z the last few years is that idea of, or in the last maybe year or so, especially with the likes of Taylor Swift, Lana Del Rey, back in the charts and in culture, is that idea of leaning into passivity as a woman, or rejection, or like, in this culture of dump him, what does it mean if you're dumped?
Interesting. Yeah.
And actually, leaning into that idea of not being in charge of your life,
and having lots of vulnerability and not being
having vulnerability, and kind of building on that and turning that into empathy for the member of the opposite sex.
Yeah, interesting. Do you think we'll see that from men too, like more sort of sentimentality or vulnerability?
I think certainly like part of that masculinity trend does touch on that, and also some of the more sensitive aspects of blue collar revival. Mm-hmm. I think we're not quite there yet. I think some of the stuff we talked about as kind of the trends we're seeing right now in 2024 around hypermasculinity, and it is a bit more kind of rough and rugged and maybe a bit more rigid.
Bit of contradiction to
but I think kind of, when we're thinking about these trends for 2026, 2027, we are moving back into that more like sentimental space.
Holly, why don't we finish off with our biggest point of contention? So,
oh God,
this return of the guys, girl.
Oh my God, me and Marina are going to get in a physical fight. It's a primal fight.
Exactly.
Hypermasculinity to feminine.
Absolutely. Yeah, Love Lies Bleeding style. I feel like we're going to see a bit of a return or revenge of the guys, girl. Marina's least favorite person in the world.
Well, it's just, to me, the pick-me girl who ultimately puts down other women to try and make themselves feel better. So I'm like, how can I support that?
But as a girl's girl, she is also a girl.
Oh,
you should fight extension.
Touche, Holly. I support all women.
Glad we got that sound.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's something I've been keeping tabs on. I think because of this lack of empathy between the genders, and because especially in the dating sphere, anecdotally as well among my friends, it feels like we don't have as many friends of the opposite sex as we maybe used to, maybe when we were children, or previous generations did, or that we thought we would. And actually this, we feel quite isolated from them, especially because a lot of the for example, we're seeing a lot of men get together for men's circles, and we're seeing women get together for, again, women in STEM, or, female-led dinner parties, which is great. And, that's been so useful and essential these last few years in building those networks. But now it feels like we're getting to a point where people actually want to kind of desegregate those spaces and assimilate,
which is fair enough. I'll take that.
Yeah, and I think one of the ways, we've talked about sport, we've talked about weightlifting and the gym and things like that. That's a great space for men and women to kind of get back together. And I think the guys' girl, as we know, is very like, she watches football. She drinks things.
I mean, I watch football for Taylor Swift. I mean, I'm now just like spitting off stereotypes, but yeah, I think, and I do feel like the return to sort of IRL stuff and going offline and like wanting to find meaningful connections will also, I think, help with that as well. And is she gonna be the girl who's like, I'm just picturing the cool girl from Gone Girl. Are we gonna see that where it's like a total performative thing, or are they gonna be genuinely just cooler?
I think it's gonna be something new. It's gonna be someone who kind of reforms the idea of the sisterhood and brings men into the sisterhood.
Love that.
Because that's something one of our Gen Zs said, was that, like, you've said this a few times now, the last few years has been about women entering male spaces, which has been amazing and so necessary. But now it feels like we're finally at the point where men can enter female spaces. So maybe it is about the sisterhood kind of like breaking out of just being sisters. And
I think also, as we're seeing, I mean, sorry, last point, I promise, but as sort of like female skewing hobbies, you know, our fandoms around like Taylor Swift or around sort of different entertainment has always been kind of like dismissed or not taken as seriously. But as we've seen, that the girl economy is very real, and you know, all of these different passions and interests are just as like legit incredible as, you know, men loving football, which has always been quite like respected and seen as like that's a respectable hobby. I wonder if that sort of repositioning of the girl economy and sort of girl, I'm doing inverted commas because I don't want to stick to too much, but female skewing sort of passions and hobbies and events as they become more credible and mainstream, and sort of recognize that men will actually be more intrigued to enter in those spaces as well. Guys, thank you so much. This has been a dream that went by so quickly.
I know. I feel like we've covered a lot of ground.
Yeah.
Hopefully got some amazing insights for people to listen to.
And stay tuned, because we are going to have a panel event with a few of our amazing experts and then release a report on this. So lots of great content to come.
Yeah, that'll be on 3rd of July.
Woo! Thank you.